Decades ago, a train vanished inside the Jerem Mount Tunnel without a trace. Tonight, in the middle of a raging storm, its ghostly whistle has returned. And for four friends parked at the tunnel's mouth, it isn't just a sound, it's an invitation.
The storm screamed its fury against the mountainside, a relentless assault of wind and water that turned the world into a chaotic, roaring abyss. Inside the modified 4x4, the four friends were encased in a fragile bubble of light and relative silence. The windows completely blurred by the torrential downpour, isolating them from everything except the relentless drumming on the metal roof. Bhima, solid and dependable, with his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, stared intently through the windshield wiper's frantic, useless arcs. Astra, the researcher of the group, clutched a folder of damp printed articles to her chest, her knuckles white. Kirana, ever the skeptic, scrolled through a low-battery phone with a forced look of boredom, while Dio, the audio technician, adjusted the gain on a portable recorder, his head cocked listening for anomalies in the static. Before them, a yawning chasm of darkness devoured the landscape, the entrance to the Jerem Mount Tunnel, its gaping maw seeming to pulse with a life of its own under the flickering light of the storm. "Signal's completely gone," Kirana announced, her voice cutting through the tense silence and holding up her phone to emphasize the empty signal bars. "No one knows we're out here, just like we planned, right? No distractions." Her attempt at nonchalance was betrayed by the slight tremor in her verbs, a vibration felt rather than heard. Bhima didn't turn from the window, his broad shoulders tense. "It was your plan, Kira. Authentic experience, you said. No faking. Well, here it is." He gestured vaguely at the apocalyptic weather outside. Astra interjected, her voice a calm, scholarly contrast to the atmosphere, tapping the folder. The historical records align perfectly with these conditions. The night of the disappearance in 1952 featured a storm of nearly identical magnitude, according to meteorological archives. We're replicating the environment. Dio suddenly held up a hand, his professional demeanor sharpening into intense focus. "Quiet, everyone, just listen." The command was so abrupt and absolute that the others immediately fell silent, even Kirana, their breathing seeming too loud. For a long moment, there was only the cacophony of the storm, a symphony of nature's violence. But then, woven into a brief lull between thunderclaps, something else echoed from the direction of the tunnel. It was distant, thin, and spectral, a long, mournful sound that defied the modern world. It was the unmistakable, antique wail of a steam train's whistle, a sound that had no right to exist here. Now, a sound that belonged to a ghost. A collective shiver passed through the occupants of the car. The air grew colder, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Kirana's mask of skepticism shattered, her eyes wide as she stared at the tunnel's entrance. "That was a train," she whispered, stating the impossible. Astra fumbled with her papers, pulling out a faded photocopy of a newspaper front page. "The Malang Express," she breathed, her voice full of awe and dread. "It was a steam locomotive. That's its whistle." The article says witnesses reported hearing it moments before the landslide that sealed the tunnel. Bhima's grip on the wheel tightened until his leather driving gloves creaked in protest. "This is insane! There are no tracks leading there anymore. They were ripped up in the 80s. Before anyone could formulate a rational response, the whistle came again. Doot, doot. This time it was louder, clearer, and terrifyingly closer. It wasn't a faint echo from the past. It was a present, active sound that cut through the storm with unnatural clarity. It was followed by a deeper, more visceral sensation, a low rhythmic vibration that thrummed through the very frame of their vehicle, a sensation felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears. It was the ghost of a vibration, the memory of a 1,000-ton machine pounding on iron rails that no longer existed. Dio's recorder, now pointed directly at the tunnel, captured the clean, distortion-free sound, its LED lights blinking furiously as it tried to process a signal that physics couldn't explain. The tunnel's darkness seemed to shift and coalesce, and for one heart-stopping second, a pinprick, a faint yellow light, flickered deep within its throat, the lone desperate eye of a lost train calling out from the void. The ghostly whistle did not fade away as an echo should. Instead, it was severed abruptly, leaving a vacuum of sound that was instantly filled by the raging storm. Yet, the silence it left behind felt heavier, more oppressive than any noise. Inside the 4x4, the four friends sat frozen, their minds struggling to process the auditory hallucination that their recording equipment had just so terrifyingly validated. Dio was the first to move, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the LED display on his recorder, which showed a pristine audio waveform of the whistle, a clean digital confirmation of the impossible. "It's real," he whispered, his voice hoarse with a mixture of professional triumph and primal fear. The gain was set perfectly. There's no distortion, no feedback. That sound was out there. Kirana, her earlier skepticism utterly evaporated, leaned forward from the backseat, her face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Play it back. Now, I need to hear it again." Her demand was sharp, edged with a need to anchor herself in something tangible, even if that tangible thing was a phantom sound. Bima, however, remained rigid in the driver's seat, his eyes locked on the tunnel's entrance. The brief flicker of yellow light he thought he'd seen had vanished, but the image was now burned into his retinas. Did anyone else see that? In the tunnel, a light. It was just for a second. Astra followed his gaze, her researcher's mind kicking into overdrive, trying to correlate data with phenomenon. A light? Describe it. Steady? Flickering? Like a modern lamp or something older? Before Bima could answer, Dio, compelled by a need to document everything, raised his high-powered camera and pointed its long lens toward the darkness. He fired off several rapid shots, the camera's shutter clicking like a frantic insect. The flash illuminated the sheeting rain for a microsecond, but it did nothing to pierce the profound blackness of the tunnel itself. He lowered the camera and scrolled through the images on the preview screen, his blood running cold. "There's nothing there," he said, showing the screen to the others. The photos showed only a perfect, impenetrable wall of darkness, a void that seemed to swallow the light whole. The rhythmic vibration they had felt through the car's chassis began again, a low, subaudible thrum that was more a feeling in their teeth and bones than a sound in their ears. It was the unmistakable sensation of heavy, massive wheels on iron rails, a feeling that should have been impossible. Toot! Toot! The whistle blasted again, and this time it was not mournful. It was sharp, commanding, and impatient, a sound that brooked no argument. It was a call to attention, a summons. Kirana physically jumped at the sound, her phone clattering to the floor mats. "It wants something," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "It's not just a residual echo, it's active." Astra nodded slowly, her academic fascination now completely replaced by a deep, unsettling dread. She looked down at the newspaper clipping in her lap, her eyes scanning a particular paragraph she had previously considered mere folklore. The article, it mentions a legend, that the train doesn't know it's lost, that on stormy nights it tries to complete its journey, it seeks passengers. As if on cue, The single yellow light Bhima had seen flickered back to life deep within the tunnel. This time, it did not vanish. It remained, a steady, baleful eye staring out at them from the darkness. It was not the bright white of a modern LED, but the warm, oily glow of an antique gas or oil lamp, a light from another era. It held a hypnotic quality, a fixed point in the swirling chaos of the storm. The vibration under their feet intensified, synchronizing with the steady pulse of the light, as if the train were idling, waiting. An overwhelming, almost magnetic pull seemed to emanate from the tunnel, a silent command that pressed against their wills. Dio found himself unconsciously reaching for the door handle. Bhima's foot hovered over the accelerator, an insane thought of driving toward the light flashing through his mind. The interior of the car felt suffocatingly small, a trap, while the tunnel promised something. Resolution, answers, or simply an end to the terrifying uncertainty. "Nobody move," Bhima commanded, his voice strained as he fought against the irrational impulse. "We're not going anywhere. We stay in the car. It's a trick of the mind, of the weather." But his words lacked conviction. The evidence was overwhelming. The sound, the vibration, the light, it was all too coherent, too directed. They were no longer observers of a historical mystery. They had become participants in a live phenomenon. The Jerem Tunnel was no longer a relic. It was a throat, and the lost train was its voice, calling out from 1952. And the terrible, unspoken question that hung in the air between them was the simplest and most frightening of all. If the train was here, and it was seeking passengers, what would happen if it found them? The light in the tunnel held its steady gaze, a silent answer to a question they were too afraid to ask. The command in the whistle's blast was undeniable, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain that understood only obedience and fear. For a long, paralyzing moment, no one in the car moved, each of them fighting their own internal battle against the unnatural compulsion to step out into the storm and walk toward that steady yellow eye. Dio's hand, which had been unconsciously inching toward the door handle, snapped back as if burned, and he clenched it into a fist in his lap, his knuckles white. Kirana wrapped her arms around herself, a physical gesture to hold her crumbling rationality together. "It's not real," she chanted under her breath, a desperate mantra against the overwhelming sensory evidence. "It's infrasound, low-frequency vibrations from the storm causing auditory and visual hallucinations. It's a documented phenomenon." But her explanation, once a solid shield, now felt as flimsy as paper against the reality of the throbbing vibration they could all feel in their bones. Bhima, his jaw set so tight it ached, forced his eyes away from the hypnotic light and onto the muddy ground between their vehicle and the tunnel entrance. The rain had turned the earth into a slick, treacherous soup of mud and loose rock. "Astra," he said, his voice rough with effort. "The maps, the old railway maps. Where exactly were the tracks, precisely?" Shaken from her terrified trance, Astra fumbled with her folder, her usually deft fingers clumsy. She pulled out a laminated, enlarged copy of a surveyor's map from 1948, her flashlight beam dancing across the faded lines. They ran straight in, a direct line. The tunnel is a perfect bore through the mountain for 200 meters. She then traced a line from the tunnel mouth outward. The tracks emerged here and continued along this ridge for about 50 meters before curving away. She looked up, her face ashen. The ground right in front of us, where we're parked, this was the track bed. As if the universe itself were confirming her words, a blinding fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in a stark, electric blue snapshot. In that frozen, searing instant, all four of them saw it. Etched into the mud, exactly where Astra's map indicated, were two parallel lines pressed into the earth as if by immense, invisible weight. They were perfectly spaced, running straight from the tunnel's mouth and passing directly underneath their 4x4 before disappearing over the edge of the ridge. They were the ghostly impressions of rails that had been torn up decades ago. The accompanying thunderclap was apocalyptic, a physical blow that rattled the car. But it was the sight that left them breathless. The tracks were not there. And yet they were. Kirana's theory of infrasound evaporated into the electrified air. Hallucinations were one thing. Shared, precise visual phenomena corroborated by historical documents were something else entirely. The vibration through the car's floor intensified, shifting in character. The idle thrumming became more purposeful, rhythmic clack, 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 the precise metallic sound of massive steel wheels passing over the joints in railway tracks. It was a sound that rose above the storm, clear and unmistakable. Clack, clack, clack. It was accompanied by a new, deeper sound, the heavy, labored exhalation of a steam engine working against a grade. They could hear the chuff of the piston, the hiss of steam. The yellow light in the tunnel began to grow larger, brighter. It was no longer a stationary eye. It was an eye that was moving, advancing, slowly, inexorably, coming toward them. The train was no longer idling. It was leaving the tunnel. It was beginning its journey. And according to the old map, its path would take it right through the spot where their vehicle was parked. Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke through the group's stunned paralysis. "Drive!" Dio shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "Bhima, drive, now!" Bhima needed no urging. His survival instincts overriding his fear, he turned the key. The engine of the 4x4, a modern roar they usually took for granted, coughed and sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered wildly, dimmed, and then went completely dark. The engine died. Bhima turned the key again and again, met with nothing but a sickening, hollow clicking sound from the starter motor. The electronics were dead. Completely. The clack, clack, clack grew louder, more immediate, vibrating up through their seats. The yellow light filled the windshield, washing over their terrified faces in an eerie, outdated glow. They were sitting on the ghost tracks, in a dead vehicle, as the Malang Express, lost since 1952, rolled silently out of the tunnel mouth and directly toward them. The world shrank to the size of the windshield, completely dominated by the expanding, jaundiced eye of the light. It was not the harsh beam of a modern train. It was a diffuse, oily glow that seemed to push back the darkness without illuminating it, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted like malevolent spirits in the torrential rain. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack was no longer a vibration felt through the chassis. It was a deafening percussion inside the car, a sound of immense mechanical inevitability that hammered against their eardrums and shook the very air they breathed. Inside the lifeless 4x4, the atmosphere was thick with a terror so potent it was suffocating. Bhima's hands were frozen on the useless steering wheel, his body rigid with the futile instinct to somehow steer them out of the path of the oncoming behemoth. Astra let out a choked gasp, her research folder slipping from her numb fingers, papers scattering across the floor like fallen leaves, irrelevant artifacts of a world that no longer applied. Kirana, pressed deep into the back seat as if trying to merge with the leather, screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of utter disbelief that tore from her throat, entirely swallowed by the cacophony of the phantom train and the storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, a child's defense against the monster in the room, awaiting an impact that would shatter metal and bone. Dio, however, could not look away. His videographer's instinct, a compulsion to document the impossible even at the cost of his own sanity, forced his eyes to remain open. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the front of the locomotive emerged from the tunnel. It was not a sleek, modern machine, but a hulking black beast of riveted steel and billowing phantom steam, a monstrous artifact from a forgotten time. It was terrifyingly, tangibly solid. The impact every nerve in their bodies was screaming for never came. Instead, the world dissolved into a nightmare of sensation without physics.
The yellow light did not strike the car, it passed through it. There was no sound of crushing metal or shattering glass. There was only an overwhelming, soul-deep cold, a cold that felt like the void of space, a cold that stole the breath from their lungs and seared their skin with frost. The deafening clack-clack-tack was no longer a vibration felt through the chassis. It was a deafening percussion inside the car, a sound of immense mechanical inevitability that hammered against their eardrums and shook the very air they breathed. For a terrifying 3-second eternity, they were not in a car. They were inside the locomotive. Dio, his eyes opened wide, saw the flickering interior of a firebox, the ghostly outline of a driver, the glint of ancient controls, all superimposed over the interior of their SUV, a double exposure from hell. They could smell the thick, acrid coal smoke and the hot, metallic scent of steam. They could feel the immense heat of the boiler and the biting cold of the storm, a sensory paradox that threatened to unhinge their minds. And then it was past. The light swept through them and onward, the deafening noise receding toward the back of the vehicle. The paralyzing cold lifted as suddenly as it had descended, leaving them all gasping for air, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. The interior of the 4x4 was exactly as it had been, untouched, yet forever changed. The train had not collided with them, it had passed through them as if they and their vehicle were the ghosts. Bhima sat bolt upright, sucking in huge, ragged breaths, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. Kirana slowly opened her eyes, her scream dying in her throat, replaced by a whimper of pure, uncomprehending shock. She patted her own arms, her legs, as if checking she was still whole. Dio, shaking so violently he could barely function, looked down at the camera still clutched in his hand. The record light was on. He had hit the button in his panic. With trembling fingers, he fumbled to stop the recording and switched to playback mode. The small LCD screen glowed to life. The video showed the terrifying approach of the light from his perspective inside the car. The audio was a distorted mess of storm noise and the overwhelming train sounds. And then, as the light consumed the lens, the screen on the recording did not go white. It went dark. But the audio during those 3 seconds of the train passing through them was crystal clear, utterly pristine, and horrifying. Over the clear sound of the chuffing engine and turning wheels, a new layer was audible, a cacophony of voices. Not screams of terror, but something far worse, the mundane, calm, and utterly confused chatter of dozens of people talking, murmuring, asking questions in a language decades out of date, completely unaware of the spectral nature of their journey. The Malong Express had not been empty. Its passengers were still on board.
Silence was the first thing they were aware of. A deep, ringing silence that felt heavier and more unnatural than the preceding cacophony. The storm's fury seemed muted, as if muffled by a thick blanket, and the phantom clack-clack-clack of the train had vanished completely, leaving behind only a hollow echo in their minds. The interior of the 4x4 was freezing. Their breath plumed in the air in thick white clouds, a sharp physical reminder of the spectral cold that had just invaded their space. The frost wasn't just on the air, it was on the surfaces, a delicate, intricate lacework of ice crystals spiderwebbed across the inside of the windshield and windows, obscuring the view of the storm outside and trapping them in a frozen, glittering cage. The car felt like a tomb, a chill that seeped into their clothing and bit deep into their bones, a cold that no amount of modern heating could ever hope to dispel. For a full minute, nobody spoke. The only sounds were their ragged, shuddering breaths and the muted drum of rain on the roof. Kirana was the first to break, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers that made her teeth chatter.
cold," she stammered, the word a puff of frozen vapor. She hugged herself tightly, rubbing her arms in a futile attempt to generate warmth. Bhima, his instincts as the protector kicking into gear despite his own terror, reacted. He turned the key in the ignition again, a desperate prayer on his lips. This time, the engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared reluctantly to life. He immediately cranked the heater to its maximum setting, pushing the fan to its highest speed. A blast of frigid air shot from the vents, quickly warming to a lukewarm stream, and then finally to a proper, searing heat. But the effect was bizarrely localized. The air blowing from the vents was hot, yet the pervasive, deep cold within the car's cabin refused to dissipate. It was as if the cold were emanating from them, from the very seats they sat on, from the memories held in the metal around them. Astra, her face pale and her eyes wide with a scholar's terrified awe, slowly reached out a trembling hand toward the frosted window. She didn't wipe it clear. Instead, she just stared, her mind reeling. It wasn't just energy, it was matter, or a memory of matter so strong it has a physical effect. Thermodynamics don't apply. The heat from the vents can't displace that kind of cold, because it's not a natural cold. It's a residual cold, a ghost of temperature left behind. Her scientific analysis was a desperate attempt to anchor the impossible in something resembling logic, but it did nothing to warm her. She pulled her hand back, her fingertips numb from the brief contact with the ice. Dio, meanwhile, could not tear his eyes away from the camera's small LCD screen. He had plugged in headphones, and the intimate and horrifying audio of the passengers' chatter played directly into his ears. He listened, his blood running colder than the air in the car. They don't know," he murmured, his voice hollow. Bhima glanced at him sharply from the driver's seat. "What? Who doesn't know what?" Dio slowly pulled one headphone away, letting the faint, tinny sounds leak out. "The people, the passengers on the recording, they're talking. A man is complaining about the train being behind schedule. A woman is asking her husband if he packed her good shawl. A child is asking if they're there yet." He looked up, his eyes meeting theirs, filled with a profound and unsettling pity. "They have no idea anything is wrong. They're just on a train ride. They don't know they're lost. They don't know they're dead." The implication of his words settled over them, heavier and colder than the ice on the windows. They weren't just dealing with a phantom machine, they were dealing with the souls of an entire passenger manifest trapped in a single moment of time, forever repeating their final journey. The mundane nature of their conversations was the most horrifying part of all. It wasn't screams of terror. It was the quiet, tragic normality of people completely unaware of their own doom. The residual cold in the car was no longer just a physical sensation. It was the chill of that profound cosmic tragedy, and it had seeped into their very souls, a cold that promised to follow them long after they left this cursed place. The heater roared, fighting a battle it could never win against an enemy that wasn't really there. The heater continued to blast its futile hot air, a stark contrast to the supernatural chill that had permanently leached into the very molecules of the car's interior. The frost on the windows refused to melt, its intricate patterns seeming to shift and deepen if stared at for too long, like frozen faces pressing in from another dimension. Dio's revelation about the passengers hung in the frozen air, a truth more terrifying than any ghostly apparition could ever be. These weren't malevolent spirits. They were echoes of ordinary people, trapped in the mundane final moments of their lives, utterly unaware of the catastrophic eternity that awaited them. This understanding did not lessen the fear. It amplified it with a layer of profound, heartbreaking dread. The horror was no longer about being attacked. It was about being witnessed, being known to these echoes, and being pulled into their endless repeating story. Bhima, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, stared at the now dark tunnel mouth. The yellow light was gone, the sounds had vanished, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. It was a palpable pressure against the skin. "We need to leave, now," he stated, his voice low and strained, each word a puff of frozen vapor. "The engine is running, we drive. We don't stop until we're back in the city, until we see actual streetlights." It was a simple, solid plan, born of pure survival instinct. He shifted the car into drive, his foot pressing down on the accelerator. The tires, however, did not grip the muddy ground. Instead, they spun uselessly, churning the deep mud into a brown slurry, the vehicle lurching slightly but going nowhere. They were stuck, hopelessly mired in the very track bed they had so foolishly parked upon. Astra, however, was not looking at the tunnel or the mud. She was staring, transfixed, at the passenger side window. Her own reflection, pale and terrified, was superimposed over the frost patterns. But as she watched, the frost beside her reflection began to melt. It didn't melt from the heat of the cabin, but in a very specific, deliberate way. Thin lines cleared through the ice, beating with condensation, forming shapes, letters, words. A message was etching itself onto the glass from the inside, written by an unseen, freezing finger. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words forming before her eyes. "Help us. Finish the journey." The words were clear for a moment, glistening and wet against the cold glass, before the relentless cold began to refreeze them, slowly obscuring the plea back into a blanket of white. "Look," Astra breathed, pointing a shaking finger at the window. The others turned, their eyes widening as they saw the final, fading remnants of the message. A new, overwhelming sensation washed over them, distinct from the paralyzing fear of moments before. It was a deep, resonant pang of empathy, of sorrow so profound it felt like a physical weight on their chests. It was the collective despair of dozens of souls, lost and confused, reaching out not with malice but with a desperate final hope. They could feel it. The child's longing to arrive at a grandmother's house, the man's desire to make his important meeting, the woman's worry over her unpacked shawl. These simple human desires were now suspended in eternity, and their unfinished nature created a pull, a psychic riptide trying to drag the living into their narrative to provide an ending. Kirana, tears welling in her eyes and freezing on her cheeks, spoke the thought that had infected them all. "We can't just leave them. They're so lost. They're not trying to hurt us, they just want to get where they're going." The logical part of her mind screamed that this was insanity, a dangerous delusion, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming empathetic compulsion radiating from the very air. The residual cold was no longer just cold, it was the vessel for their sadness. Dio nodded slowly, his hand resting on his recorder, the device that held the proof of their continued existence. What if we could? What if we could help them cross over, give them closure? The idea was madness, a terrifying proposition straight from a ghost story. But the alternative, driving away and leaving these souls to forever repeat their futile journey in the storm, felt in that moment like an unimaginable cruelty. The tunnel, dark and silent, no longer seemed just like a threat. It had become a path they now felt compelled to walk. The silence that followed Kirana's tearful statement and Dio's terrifying proposition was heavier than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the unspoken weight of a decision that could irrevocably alter their lives, or end them. The empathetic pull from the lingering presence was a current in the air, a silent siren song woven from decades of confusion and longing. It promised purpose, a chance to be heroes in a tragedy that had unfolded before they were born. But beneath that noble impulse thrummed the primal fear of the unknown, the certain knowledge that stepping toward that darkness was an act of defiance against every survival instinct they possessed.
The heater still roared, a pathetic monument to the world of logic and physics that had utterly abandoned them. Bhima, the pragmatist, fought against the tide of emotion, threatening to sweep them all into madness. "No," he said, the word sharp and final, cutting through the thick atmosphere. "This is not a debate. We are not paranormal investigators in a movie. We are four people stuck in a storm next to a haunted tunnel. Our only job is to get unstuck and get home." He slammed his palm against the dashboard in frustration, a sharp crack that made everyone jump. "This empathy you're feeling, it's not real. It's a trick, a lure. That thing in there," he jabbed a finger toward the tunnel, "whatever it is, doesn't want our help. It wants our company." His words were rational, sane, and they landed with the force of truth. But they were also sterile, devoid of the profound, heartbreaking connection the others were feeling from the whispered pleas on the glass. Astra, however, was already lost to the intellectual and spiritual puzzle. The message on the window had been meant for her, the researcher, the keeper of their story. She looked from Bhima's angry, fearful face to the desperate, fading words on the glass. "And what is home, Bhima?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. "Driving back to our apartments, to our lives, with this cold inside us, with their voices in our heads? We will never be home again. We've been marked by this. Don't you feel it?" She hugged herself, the shivers that racked her body not entirely from the temperature. "This isn't about being heroes. It's about finding a way to clean the stain of this night from our souls. If we can help them find peace, maybe we find our own in the process. We have a responsibility." The word responsibility hung in the air. It was a powerful, dangerous word. Dio seized upon it, holding up his recorder like a sacred talisman. "He's right that it's a lure, but Astra's right too. We are involved. We have evidence. We have a connection. They reached out to us. What if the reason the train manifests is because it's looking for someone to acknowledge it, to bear witness? Maybe that's the finishing the journey, not a physical destination, but an emotional one. Acknowledgement." He was building a theory out of desperation and hope, a fragile raft on an ocean of terror. Kirana, her face still wet with frozen tears, nodded vigorously. "I felt them, Bhima. It wasn't scary. It was just sad. So incredibly sad. We can't just leave them like that." Bhima looked at their faces, illuminated by the dashboard lights. Astra's resolve, Dio's desperate faith, Kirana's raw compassion. He was outnumbered not by argument, but by feeling. The cold in the car seemed to press in on him specifically, a gentle but insistent pressure. He thought of the train passing through them, the mundane chatter of people going about their lives, completely unaware. He thought of the child's voice on the recording, asking, "Are we there yet? Forever?" A deep, weary resignation settled over him. The fight drained out of his shoulders. He was their driver, their protector. If they were determined to walk into the throat of the beast, his job was not to stop them. It was to make sure they came back out. With a sigh that plumed thickly in the frigid air, he turned off the engine, plunging them into a silence broken only by the storm outside. "Fine," he said, the word tasting like ash, "but we do this my way. We go in, we look, we do not touch anything. We do not split up, and the second I say we leave, we leave. No arguments." The decision was made. They were going into the tunnel. The moment Bhima killed the engine, the world outside the frosted windows seemed to grow larger, more menacing. The storm's roar, which had been a constant, almost comforting white noise, now felt like a hostile force surrounding their fragile metal shell. Stepping out into it was an act of sheer will, a defiance of every screaming instinct. Bhima went first, his boots sinking into the deep, cold mud with a sickening squelch. The wind immediately tore at his jacket, and the rain needled his face with icy precision. He turned, helping the others out one by one. Each step away from the vehicle felt like a step off the edge of the world. The 4x4, with its dead electronics and frozen interior, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a relic they were abandoning at the mouth of the abyss. They assembled before the tunnel, a small, shivering band illuminated by the weak, trembling beams of their handheld flashlights. The lights did little to pierce the absolute darkness within. Instead, they seemed to be swallowed after only a few meters, making the void beyond feel even more immense and hungry. The air here was different. The wind from the storm swirled and eddied at the entrance, but refused to blow inside, as if even the natural elements feared to trespass. A stale, damp odor wafted out from the darkness, the smell of wet stone, of ancient rot, and underneath it, a faint metallic tang of coal smoke and rust that had no place in the modern air. It was the breath of the tunnel, and it was cold and dead. Bhima took point, his flashlight held in a white-knuckled grip, sweeping the beam ahead. "Stay close. Watch your step," he commanded, his voice barely louder than the howling wind at their backs. The threshold of the tunnel was not a clean line, but a gradient of reality. With one step, the sound of the storm behind them became muffled, distant, as if they were closing a heavy door. With the next step, the temperature dropped precipitously, the chill from the car now magnified tenfold, seeping through their clothes and gnawing at their bones. It was the deep, settled cold of a grave. Ostro followed, her own light focused on the ground, looking for any sign of the spectral rails, her researcher's mind still desperately cataloging data, even as her soul trembled. Kirana and Dial brought up the rear, their lights dancing nervously across the wet, curved walls of the tunnel, jumping at every drip of water and trickle of mud. After only 10 meters, the daylight from the entrance was gone, consumed by the oppressive blackness. The world shrank to the small, moving islands of light from their torches. The walls were streaked with mineral deposits and choked in places by thick cobwebs that glistened wetly in the beams. And then, Dio's light caught something. "There," he whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. On the tunnel wall, about eye level, was a faded, peeling advertisement painted directly onto the stone. It was for a soap brand, featuring a woman in a 1940s hairstyle smiling obliviously. The paint was cracked and blistered, but unmistakable. It was an artifact from the tunnel's active days, a splash of color from a world long gone. Seeing something so mundane, so human in this terrifying place was jarring. It was a stark reminder that real, living people had once passed through here. They pressed on, the tunnel stretching before them into an impossible darkness. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the silence became a physical presence. It was a silence that was not empty, but full, heavy with the weight of the mountain above them and the decades of absence within. Their footsteps, the scuff of their boots on the damp stones, seemed like sacrilegiously loud intrusions. And then a new sound began to weave itself into the silence. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as the wind or their imagination, but it grew steadily clearer. It was the distant, cheerful melody of a big band tune, the kind played on a crackling radio. A man's laughter echoed faintly, followed by the low murmur of a conversation they couldn't quite make out. The sounds weren't coming from ahead or behind, they seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very air, a haunting radio broadcast from a train that was both everywhere and nowhere, welcoming them deeper into its eternal journey. The past was not just remembered here, it was playing on a loop, and they had just stepped onto the stage. The cheerful, crackling big band tune swelled around them, a ghostly radio signal bleeding through the fabric of time. It was joined by the clinking of glass, the murmur of polite conversation, and the rustle of newspaper.
a symphony of mundane life from another era that was utterly horrifying in its misplaced normalcy. The sounds didn't have a single source. It seemed to emanate from the damp air itself, from the cold stone walls, creating a disorienting auditory panorama that made it feel like they were walking through a crowded, invisible room. Their flashlight beams, once focused tools, now seemed feeble and disrespectful, slicing through a gathering they were not invited to. The tunnel was no longer an empty bore through a mountain. It was a vessel, and it was filled to capacity with unseen passengers. Astra stopped suddenly, her light beam fixed on the tunnel wall, her breath hitched. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The rest of them followed her gaze. The weak light did not just illuminate rough-hewn rock anymore. Faintly, superimposed over the stone, they could see the elegant curved outline of a train window. And beyond the glass, visible for a heart-stopping second, was the face of a young woman peering out into the darkness. She wasn't looking at them. Her expression was one of bored anticipation, her chin resting on her hand. Then, the image faded, like a projection losing focus, leaving only the wet, dark rock behind. They weren't just hearing the past, they were beginning to see it, flickering at the edges of their vision like a dying film reel. A wave of dizziness washed over Kirana, and she stumbled, putting a hand out to steady herself against the tunnel wall. The moment her palm made contact with the cold, wet stone, the world dissolved. The tunnel, her friends, the flashlights, all of it vanished. She was standing in a warmly lit, elegantly appointed train carriage. Plush velvet seats in deep maroon, polished wood paneling, brass fittings gleaming under soft shaded lamps. A man in a crisp suit across the aisle smiled at her, nodding politely. The air was warm, smelling of cigar smoke and perfume. She could feel the gentle, rhythmic sway of the train car, hear the clear, unmistakable clack-clack-clack of wheels on rails beneath her feet. It was so real, so solid, so comforting. A voice, gentle and concerned, spoke next to her. "Are you quite all right, miss? You look pale." She turned to see an elderly woman in a feathered hat, her face etched with genuine worry. Back in the tunnel, the others saw Kirana freeze, her eyes wide and unseeing, a beatific, confused smile touching her lips. "Kira?" Dio said, reaching for her. The moment his hand touched her shoulder, he was violently ejected from the tunnel. He was suddenly sitting in a seat, the big band music loud and clear in his ears. A uniformed conductor was walking down the aisle, politely asking for tickets. Dio fumbled in his jacket pocket, a part of his mind screaming that this was wrong. But the compulsion to belong, to play his part, was overwhelming. He could feel the ticket between his fingers, crisp and real. Bhima and Astra watched in horror as both their friends became catatonic, their bodies rigid, their eyes seeing a reality that wasn't there. They were still physically in the tunnel, but their minds, their very essences, had been pulled into the memory. The psychic pull of the passengers was no longer a gentle tug of empathy. It was a riptide, actively assimilating them, inviting them to take their seats and stay forever. The mundane, comforting reality of the train carriage was the most dangerous lure of all. It promised an escape from the cold, the fear, and the storm. It offered a peaceful, permanent seat in the past, and their friends were accepting the invitation. Bhima knew with a cold certainty that if they were pulled in completely, they would never come back. They would become new echoes, forever lost on the Malong Express.
Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Bhima. This was no longer an investigation, it was a rescue mission against an enemy that had no form, only feeling. Kirana and Dio stood frozen, their eyes glazed over with the warm light of a non-existent train carriage, their bodies humming with the vibration of phantom rails. The gentle, concerned voices of the unseen passengers whispered just for them, a siren song of normalcy that was far more seductive than any horror. Astra stood paralyzed, a scholar witnessing her hypothesis come to terrifying, life-altering life. Bhima acted on pure instinct. He grabbed Kirana's arm, his grip like a vice, and physically yanked her backward, away from the wall. At the same moment, he shouted at Astra,
a raw, guttural command that cut through the spectral orchestra. "Astra, now, your light, shine it on him. Don't let it touch the walls." The violent motion and the sheer force of his will seemed to create a rupture in the illusion. Karana gasped as if emerging from deep water, the pleasant smile vanishing, replaced by a disoriented terror. The warm carriage, the polite man, the worried woman, they dissolved into the oppressive, freezing darkness of the tunnel. She stumbled, clutching Bhima's arm, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gulps. "It was so real," she choked out. "They were so kind." Astra, shaken into action, focused her flashlight beam directly on Dio's face, creating a stark, modern circle of white light that isolated him from the shadows where the past thrived. The effect was immediate. The concerned conductor asking for his ticket flickered and distorted, his friendly face stretching into a mask of static before vanishing. Dio blinked, the crisp ticket in his hand dissolving into nothingness. He shuddered violently, returning to the terrifying reality of the tunnel, his professional curiosity utterly extinguished and replaced by primal fear. "They're not just echoes," Astra said, her voice trembling but clear, her light unwavering on Dio. "They're a pattern, a consciousness. They're lonely. They want to complete their passenger manifest. They want company for the journey." Her analysis was no longer academic. It was a battlefield assessment. The friendly, mundane atmosphere was the trap's bait. The tunnel itself was the jaws. The collective will of the lost souls was trying to overwrite their reality, to absorb them into the memory and make them a permanent part of its endless loop. The compulsion to stay, to just sit down and rest in the warm light, was a tangible force pressing against their minds. "We're leaving, now!" Bhima roared, his voice echoing down the stone corridor, a defiant sound against the whispers of the past. He didn't wait for agreement. He turned Karana around, pushing her back the way they came, keeping a firm grip on her arm. Astra followed, her flashlight beam sweeping frantically behind them, as if trying to hold the encroaching past at bay. Dio brought up the rear, stumbling but moving, his own light dancing wildly. The cheerful music began to distort, the upbeat trumpet solo sliding into a discordant, mournful wail. The polite murmurs of conversation shifted into overlapping, confused questions. "Where are we going? Why has it gotten so dark? I can't find my daughter." The voices were laced with dawning fear, the first cracks in their placid delusion, and the sound was infinitely more terrifying than their earlier calm. They ran, their footsteps splashing through puddles, their breath pluming in the freezing air. The circle of daylight at the tunnel's mouth was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen, a promise of a world that made sense. They burst out into the raging storm, the wind and rain feeling like a baptism, washing away the stagnant air of the tomb. They didn't stop until they collapsed against the cold, wet metal of their 4x4, gasping and trembling, their clothes soaked with rain and sweat. They had escaped the tunnel. But as they looked back at the dark, silent maw, they knew the cold was still inside them. The faint, distant sound of a steam whistle was still a permanent frequency in their minds. They had helped no one. They had only just saved themselves. The Malang Express was still in there, running its eternal route, forever almost arriving, its passengers forever almost home. And they were now, and would always be, acutely aware of its lonely, desperate journey. They had not found closure. They had only become unwilling witnesses.